Hey Flash Historian subscribers, tonight we step into the choking fog and flickering gaslight of Victorian London. A city where wealth and misery lived side by side like bitter neighbors sharing the same collapsing wall. A place where one man might dine beneath crystal chandeliers while another freezes to death only a few streets away. This was the age of industry. Of invention. Of progress. At least, that's what the newspapers claimed. But for the millions packed into London's filthy alleys and overcrowded tenements, progress mostly smelled like coal smoke, horse manure, and untreated sewage. Tonight, we are not visiting the elegant London of royal palaces and polished carriages. We are wandering into the harsher city. The hidden one. The London of factory workers, chimney sweeps, exhausted mothers, barefoot children, and streets so thick with fog you could lose yourself 10 feet from your own front door. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting through these strange corners of history with me. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always interesting to see how many viewers are watching over all the world. Now lower the lights, maybe turn on AC or a fan for that soft comforting hum, and let the sounds of modern life slowly fade away as we wander together into Victorian London. You wake up cold. Not the sort of cold fixed by pulling a blanket tighter around yourself. No, this is the deep damp cold that settles into the bones of old buildings and tired people. The kind that creeps through cracked walls and broken windows and never really leaves. Your eyes open slowly, and the first thing you notice is that someone's elbow is pressed against your ribs. That would be your younger brother. His foot, meanwhile, is somehow near your shoulder. Across the room, your mother is already awake, crouched near the fireplace trying to convince a few weak embers to become a fire. The room smells of smoke, mildew, wet wool, and too many human beings packed together for too many years. This single room is your entire world. Kitchen, bedroom, dining room, laundry space, nursery, and occasionally hospital. 7 people sleep here. 8 if your uncle has lost another job and come back asking for a corner of floor space. The walls are stained dark with soot. Water creeps down them in thin trails whenever it rains, which in London feels like almost every other day. The ceiling sags slightly overhead as though the building itself is exhausted. The mattress beneath you is little more than straw stuffed into rough cloth. It crunches when you move. Something tiny skitters underneath it during the night, but you stopped checking months ago. It is better not to know exactly how many creatures share the bed with you. The blanket covering your legs has holes large enough to let the cold through freely. Still, it is one of the better blankets in the building. Your neighbor downstairs sleeps beneath old potato sacks stitched together with twine. Near the corner of the room sits a bucket. Everyone pretends not to look directly at it. During the night it serves as the family toilet. In the morning, someone carries it outside and empties it into the gutter with hundreds of other families doing exactly the same thing. There is no plumbing here. No clean running water. No warm bath waiting at the end of a hard day. Just buckets, grime, and the constant hope that disease chooses someone else this winter. Outside, the city is already awake. You hear wagon wheels clattering over cobblestones. Horses snorting in the cold morning air. Street vendors shouting about hot pies, cheap onions, and suspiciously fresh fish. Somewhere nearby, a factory whistle screams loud enough to rattle the windows. And beneath it all comes the endless coughing. Everyone coughs in Victorian London. Children cough. Factory workers cough. Elderly women cough until they bend double in the streets. The city itself seems to cough. Smoke pours endlessly from thousands of chimneys, mixing with damp fog until the air becomes thick enough to taste. You swing your feet onto the floor and immediately regret it. The boards are freezing. One plank bends alarmingly under your weight. Another lets out a loud creak that sounds almost human, like the house itself groaning in pain. Your mother hands you breakfast. A piece of bread. Not fresh bread, either. This loaf has survived several days already and now possesses the density of construction material. You chew carefully, partly because it is hard as stone and partly because bread sometimes contains things bakers would rather not discuss. Sawdust. Chalk. Ground beans. Even plaster. Anything to make flour stretch further. Beside the bread is tea. Weak, watery tea. But at least the water has been boiled. That makes it safer than drinking directly from the public pump, where the water occasionally arrives with extra surprises floating in it. You eat quickly because there is work to do. There is always work to do. Victorian London never truly rests. Outside the building, the fog waits like a living thing. Thick yellow-gray smoke curls through the streets, swallowing lamp-posts and rooftops alike. Londoners call it pea soup fog, though it resembles no soup anyone would willingly eat. The fog burns your throat almost instantly. Coal smoke clings to your clothes and hair. Every breath feels slightly used already, as though someone else inhaled it first. Visibility is terrible. You can barely see across the street. Figures emerge from the mist like ghosts, appearing suddenly before vanishing again into grey nothingness. Horses loom silently beside carts. Men shout warnings moments before collisions. Somewhere ahead, two women argue loudly over cab fare neither can properly see. The fog changes people. Faces disappear. Shapes blur. The city becomes strange and dreamlike, almost unreal. At night it grows worse. Criminals love the fog. So do pickpockets. Entire stories circulate about people walking straight into canals or wandering into the wrong neighborhood and never returning home at all. But the city continues moving regardless. London cannot stop simply because breathing feels difficult. You walk carefully down the narrow alley beside your building. Mud squelches beneath your boots. Or at least you hope it is mud. Victorian streets contain an astonishing variety of liquids, and asking too many questions about them only makes life harder. The gutters overflow with waste. Horse manure lies everywhere. Rotting vegetables spill from market carts. Fish guts glisten beside broken bottles and ashes dumped from fireplaces. Stray dogs wander through it all searching for scraps. Thin cats slink between crates. Rats move boldly through the filth like tiny landlords inspecting their property. And then there are the smells. The smell of coal smoke. The smell of sewage. The smell of wet leather, stale beer, rotting cabbage, and unwashed humanity. Sometimes all at once. London in the 19th century was enormous beyond imagination. Millions of people crowded into the city searching for work and opportunity. Factories expanded constantly. New railways carved through neighborhoods. Wealth poured into the capital from across the empire. But prosperity did not spread evenly. For every wealthy gentleman buying silk gloves and imported wine, thousands struggled simply to survive the week. The poor packed into overcrowded districts where entire families rented corners of rooms or slept in cellars beneath street level. Disease moved quickly here. Cholera outbreaks swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Tuberculosis lingered constantly in the smoky air. Typhoid, influenza, scarlet fever, illness felt less like bad luck and more like part of daily life. Doctors existed, of course. But medical knowledge was limited, and proper treatment expensive. Many people relied on home remedies, patent medicines, or hopeful superstition. If someone told you rubbing onions on your feet might cure fever, you probably tried it. Mostly because the alternative was doing nothing. As you move through the streets, you pass children already working. Tiny boys with blackened faces hurry toward chimneys carrying brushes and rope. Match girls walk quickly through the fog on their way to factories where dangerous chemicals slowly destroy their health. Newsboys shout headlines while weaving between wagons. Childhood in Victorian London could be brutally short. Many families depended on every member earning money. A child too young to reach a factory machine might still carry coal, sell flowers, polish boots, or sweep crossings. School was a luxury many could not afford. Hunger usually arrived first. You eventually reach the market. The noise strikes you immediately. Vendors shouting over one another. Chickens flapping wildly inside cages. Carts rattling over stones. Buyers arguing loudly about prices. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing an accordion terribly. Food lines the stalls in uneven rows. Potatoes. Turnips. Onions. Eels twisting in buckets. Meat pies of uncertain origin. Bread stacked high beside flies that seem equally interested in purchasing it. Fresh food costs money. More money than many possess. So meals become repetitive. Bread. Potatoes. Cheap tea. Occasional scraps of meat when fortune smiles kindly. Still, the market feels alive. Busy. Human. People laugh here despite everything. Someone tells a joke. Someone sings while unloading vegetables. A woman bargains fiercely over cabbage prices with the determination of a military commander negotiating peace terms. Victorian London could be harsh beyond belief, but people still found ways to survive emotionally. Humor helped. Community helped. Sometimes all you had was the ability to laugh at misery before it swallowed you whole. As the day stretches onward, factory whistles echo again through the city. Workers disappear into giant brick buildings where machines roar endlessly for 12 or 14 hours at a time. Inside, conditions are dreadful. The air is hot and thick with dust. Machinery shakes the floors constantly. Deafening noise fills every room. Injuries happen quickly and often. Fingers lost. Hair caught in gears. Bones broken beneath belts and wheels. And yet people keep coming back because wages, however miserable, are necessary. Missing work might mean losing everything. By afternoon, exhaustion hangs over the city like another layer of fog. Faces look gray with soot and fatigue. Clothes smell of smoke and sweat. Even the horses appear tired. But London after dark remains restless. Gas lamps flicker weakly through the mist. Pubs fill with workers desperate for warmth and temporary escape. Music spills into alleyways alongside laughter and arguments. Somewhere in the distance, church bells ring through the smoke-covered skyline. The wealthy retreat into brightly lit homes with thick curtains and roaring fireplaces. The poor huddle together against the cold. And above everyone, the endless chimneys continue pouring smoke into the sky. Victorian London was a city of contradictions. Splendor and suffering. Innovation and cruelty. Beauty and filth existing side by side. It shaped the modern world while grinding countless ordinary people into exhaustion along the way. And yet somehow, every morning, the city woke again. Wagons rolled. Markets opened. Factories screamed to life. And millions stepped back into the fog because survival left them little choice. So tonight, as you settle beneath clean blankets in a quieter world, perhaps spare a thought for the people of Victorian London. For the workers breathing coal smoke before sunrise. For the children carrying matches through icy streets. For the families packed into tiny rooms above endless noise and endless fog. Because history is not only kings and queens and grand speeches. Sometimes history is simply ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship one cold morning at a time. The streets of Victorian London were never truly clean. They could not be. There were simply too many people, too many horses, too many factories, and nowhere for the filth to go except deeper into the city itself. Every morning, the streets woke already dirty, as though the night had spent hours carefully layering fresh misery over yesterday's grime. You step carefully onto the cobblestones outside your building, though, carefully, in London mostly means trying to guess which puddles are water and which puddles are something far worse. The gutters overflow constantly with rainwater, sewage, rotten vegetables, horse manure, and ash from thousands upon thousands of coal fires. Everything mixes together into a dark sludge that creeps slowly downhill through the streets like the city itself is melting. The smell arrives before anything else. Not one smell, but hundreds of them stacked together in the cold morning air. Coal smoke from factory chimneys. Rotting meat from market stalls. Wet leather. Spoiled milk. Human waste. Dead rats left in alleyways. Fish guts baking beside the curb. And underneath it all, the thick sour scent of the Thames River, carrying the waste of an entire city downstream while somehow remaining the very same river many people still depend on for water. You try not to breathe too deeply. Most Londoners learn that trick early. Small breaths. Quick breaths. Anything to avoid tasting the city too much. But avoiding the smell is impossible. It clings to your clothes. It settles into your hair. It follows you home at night and waits in your blankets until morning. Victorian London does not simply surround you. It enters you. The fog makes everything worse. By dawn, the streets disappear beneath a yellow-gray haze thick enough to swallow buildings whole. This is no gentle country mist drifting harmlessly through fields. This is industrial fog. Coal smoke mixed with damp air until it becomes something heavy and alive. Londoners call it pea soup fog, though it resembles a soup made by someone who deeply hates humanity. Street lamps glow weakly through the haze like drowning stars. Horses emerge suddenly from the mist, enormous and silent until they are nearly on top of you. Men shout warnings from somewhere unseen. Wagon wheels scrape against stone. Somewhere nearby, a woman coughs violently enough to sound as though her lungs are trying to escape. Everyone coughs in Victorian London. Children cough on street corners while selling flowers. Chimney sweeps cough black soot into dirty handkerchiefs. Factory workers cough through entire conversations. Elderly men bend double in alleys, gasping for breath between spasms that seem to shake their entire bodies apart. The city itself sounds sick. Doctors speak often about bad air, poisonous vapors, and unhealthy fumes. Some believe disease floats through the atmosphere itself. Others blame foul smells directly. No one fully understands germs yet, though the evidence surrounds them constantly in the form of overflowing graveyards and crowded hospitals. Illness spreads quickly here because people live practically on top of one another. Entire families share single damp rooms where fresh air rarely enters and sickness rarely leaves. If one person develops tuberculosis, everyone breathes the same air. If cholera arrives in the neighborhood, fear spreads almost faster than the disease itself. And cholera is terrifying. It comes suddenly. A stomach pain. Vomiting. Cramping. Weakness. Then dehydration so severe people sometimes appear to shrink before death takes them entirely. Entire streets panic when rumors of cholera begin circulating. Families avoid public pumps. Mothers boil water obsessively if they can afford enough coal. Church bells ring constantly during outbreaks, each toll another reminder that someone nearby did not survive the night. The cruelest part is that many people unknowingly poison themselves simply by trying to stay alive. London's drinking water often comes directly from sources contaminated with sewage. Waste flows freely into the Thames, and companies still collect water downstream to sell back to the population. Imagine drinking from a river already carrying the city's garbage, dead animals, industrial chemicals, and human waste. Now imagine paying for the privilege. In the summer, conditions become unbearable. Heat settles over the streets like a damp blanket. The smell intensifies until even lifelong Londoners complain openly. Rotting food cooks slowly beneath the sun. Sewage bubbles in gutters. Swarms of flies gather everywhere, on meat, on faces, on open wounds. Horses collapse from exhaustion in the streets, sometimes remaining there for hours before removal crews arrive. Children continue playing nearby regardless. They must. There are few other places to go. You pass barefoot boys splashing through puddles no sane person would touch willingly. Young girls chase one another between carts while holding stale bread like treasure. Babies cry from windows above narrow alleyways where sunlight barely reaches the ground. Disease becomes so ordinary that people almost stop discussing it unless someone important dies. Families expect sickness the way modern people expect rain. You survive one winter only to worry about the next. A cough lingering too long becomes a quiet source of dread. Fever in a child turns entire households silent. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, moves like a ghost through Victorian London. Slow. Patient. Relentless. At first it seems harmless enough. A small cough. Tiredness. Pale skin. Then the illness settles deeper into the lungs. Victims grow thinner and thinner no matter how much they eat. They cough blood into cloths they try desperately to hide from family members. Some continue working until physically unable to stand because missing wages means missing meals. Many never recover. The poor suffer worst of all because proper nutrition, warm housing, and rest remain luxuries beyond reach. Damp rooms weaken the body. Smoke damages the lungs. Endless labor exhausts people already barely surviving. Disease finds easy targets everywhere. And then there is smallpox. Entire neighborhoods fear its arrival. The fever. The blisters. The scars left behind even for survivors. Parents pray constantly for children to avoid it. Some families hang strange charms near beds or follow old folk remedies passed through generations because medicine itself offers little certainty. Doctors exist, yes, but trust in them varies greatly. Many treatments appear nearly as dangerous as the illnesses themselves. Leeches. Bleeding. Strange tonics filled with alcohol or opium. Powders promising miracle cures. Bottles sold loudly in markets by smiling men who disappear before customers realize the medicine accomplished absolutely nothing. A tooth infection alone can become a death sentence. A cut from rusty metal can turn black and swollen within days. Something as simple as stepping on a dirty nail may eventually kill you slowly through infection. There are no antibiotics. No modern surgeries. No quick pharmacy visits. The human body either fights illness successfully or it does not. Hospitals inspire fear more than comfort. From outside, they appear enormous and grim, their tall brick walls stained dark by soot and weather. Inside, rows of patients lie crowded together while overworked doctors move quickly between them carrying instruments rarely cleaned properly between operations. The smell inside hospitals is unforgettable. Blood. Sweat. Chemicals. Sickness. Fear. Patients whisper stories about surgeries performed without proper pain relief. About amputations completed while orderlies physically hold screaming people in place. About infections spreading through entire wards after one operation goes wrong. Many avoid hospitals entirely until desperation leaves no alternative. Back on the streets, life continues regardless of disease because survival requires movement. Vendors still shout over crowds. Factory whistles still scream through the fog. Carriages still rattle past coughing beggars huddled beneath bridges. London never pauses long enough to mourn properly. Even funerals become ordinary sights. Black carriages roll through muddy streets carrying coffins toward overcrowded cemeteries. Gravediggers work constantly. Church bells echo through smoky air so often that many barely notice them anymore. Death is not shocking in Victorian London. It is familiar. Expected. Practically woven into the rhythm of daily life itself. And yet somehow people endure. They laugh in pubs after impossible days. They fall in love beside filthy alleyways. Mothers sing children to sleep while factory smoke drifts through cracked windows. Neighbors share bread during hard winters. Workers joke while covered in soot because humor remains one of the few luxuries poverty cannot fully steal. Victorian London is brutal, unhealthy, and endlessly exhausting. But it is also alive. Loudly, stubbornly alive. The city coughs, rots, floods, and chokes beneath its own ambition, yet every morning millions still wake beneath smoke-blackened ceilings and step once more into the fog. Death was never far away in Victorian London. You saw it in the black ribbons hanging from doorways. You heard it in the church bells echoing through the fog. You smelled it in overcrowded graveyards where the earth itself seemed exhausted from swallowing so many bodies. In this city, people did not speak about death as some distant tragedy waiting quietly at the end of life. Death walked beside you every single day. Sometimes close enough to touch. You notice it first in the mornings. As the city wakes beneath its blanket of smoke and damp fog, funeral carts already creak through the streets. Horses move slowly over the cobblestones while black-clothed families follow behind in silence. Some mourn openly. Others simply look tired. In Victorian London, grief often had to compete with survival. The church bells ring so often that eventually people stop pausing to listen. Another child gone from fever. Another factory worker crushed beneath machinery. Another elderly woman who simply did not wake during the night because the cold finally became stronger than she was. Death becomes part of the background noise of the city. Like coughing. Like rain. Like wagon wheels rattling through muddy streets. Children understand this frighteningly early. A Victorian child grows up surrounded by illness and funerals. Brothers disappear after winters filled with coughing. Sisters fade slowly from tuberculosis. Infants sometimes survive only a few days before tiny coffins appear quietly beside the family door. Parents try not to grow too hopeful. Hope can become dangerous in a place where disease moves faster than doctors. Some families avoid naming newborn babies immediately, waiting nervously to see whether the child survives long enough to become truly part of the household. And when death arrives, life rarely pauses for long. A grieving father still must work the next morning. A mother still scrubs clothes while mourning a lost child because hunger does not care about heartbreak. Bills continue arriving. Rent continues demanding payment. Victorian London leaves very little space for proper sorrow. The graveyards themselves are terrifying places. By the middle of the 19th century, many cemeteries are so overcrowded that coffins practically touch one another beneath the soil. Graves are dug quickly and packed tightly together. In poorer districts, the smell of decay sometimes rises directly from the earth after heavy rain. People whisper disturbing stories about grave robbers working at night. About bodies stolen from fresh graves and sold illegally to medical schools where anatomy students need corpses for study. Families sometimes guard burial sites themselves, terrified their loved ones might disappear before sunrise. Iron cages called mort safes appear over some graves to prevent theft. Imagine loving someone so much that after burying them, you must also protect them from being stolen. Victorian London finds ways to make even funerals exhausting. Then there is the fear of dying alone. This may be the cruelest fear of all. London is enormous. Millions of people packed together, yet loneliness hides everywhere. Elderly widows die quietly in rented rooms while neighbors notice only because the coughing suddenly stops. Poor laborers collapse in alleyways unnoticed beneath the fog. Some disappear into workhouses and never return. The workhouse frightens people almost as much as death itself. For the desperately poor, entering a workhouse often means surrendering what little dignity remains. Families are separated. Husbands sent one direction, wives another, children elsewhere entirely. The food is miserable. The rules harsh. Many describe the buildings as prisons for poverty. Some elderly people would rather die in their own freezing room than enter one. And honestly, many do. Winter is especially deadly. Cold creeps through cracked walls and broken windows. Coal becomes expensive. Families burn scraps of wood, old furniture, sometimes even clothing to stay warm. Frost gathers inside rooms during the night. Breath hangs visibly in the air while people sleep beneath thin blankets already damp from the weather. Each winter brings fresh fear. Will there be enough food? Enough coal? Enough strength left in tired lungs to survive until spring? Tuberculosis moves silently through these cold rooms like an invisible visitor. Victims grow thinner week by week. Their skin turns pale. Their cough deepens. Sometimes blood appears on handkerchiefs hidden quickly from frightened relatives. And yet even then, people continue working for as long as possible. You might pass a man hauling crates through the market while secretly dying from consumption. A woman sewing clothes by candlelight despite fever burning behind her eyes. A child delivering newspapers while shivering violently from illness. Missing work means missing meals, and hunger can kill just as surely as disease. Doctors, meanwhile, often inspire more anxiety than comfort. Medical science is improving slowly, but for ordinary people, treatment still feels uncertain and frightening. A doctor may prescribe bleeding, strange powders, or tonics packed with alcohol and opium. Some remedies help. Others simply empty your wallet before you die anyway. Hospitals carry their own terrible reputation. Many Londoners see them not as places of healing but as places people go when death has already begun waiting nearby. The buildings smell of chemicals, sweat, blood, and sickness. Patients crowd together in long rows. Surgeons reuse instruments without proper cleaning because germs remain poorly understood. Infection spreads quickly. Operations are horrifying. Before modern anesthesia, surgery means pain beyond imagination. Even after anesthesia becomes more common, sanitation remains terrible. A successful operation may still end in deadly infection days later. People hear stories constantly. A man enters hospital for a broken leg and dies from fever. A woman survives childbirth only to develop infection afterward. A child loses an arm after a factory accident because doctors have no better option. No wonder many avoid hospitals until desperation forces them through the doors. Even simple injuries become sources of quiet panic. A rusty nail. A deep cut while working. A swollen tooth. Today such problems might mean inconvenience. In Victorian London, they can become fatal. Infection lurks everywhere in a city drowning in dirt and overcrowding. People live carefully because life itself feels fragile. You notice it in small habits. Mothers wrapping scarves tighter around children during winter fog. Men avoiding certain neighborhoods during outbreaks. Families boiling water obsessively when rumors of cholera begin spreading nearby. Fear shapes the rhythm of the city. But strangely, so does acceptance. Victorian Londoners become experts at continuing despite constant danger. They joke beside graves. Drink beside hospitals. Fall in love beneath smoke-blackened skies. Human beings adapt even to terrible circumstances because the alternative is despair. And still, death remains everywhere. You see it in mourning dresses hanging from washing lines. In funeral notices pasted beside advertisements for soap and theater shows. In black horses pulling narrow coffins through muddy streets while strangers barely glance up from their errands. The city grows so quickly, so chaotically, that sometimes it feels as though London itself is consuming people faster than they can be buried. Yet every morning, the bells ring again. Factory whistles scream through the fog. Market vendors shout over crowded streets. And millions wake once more beneath soot-covered ceilings hoping, quietly and stubbornly, to survive another day in the harsh heart of Victorian London. Hospitals in Victorian London were places people feared almost as much as the diseases themselves. From the outside, the buildings looked enormous and grim, their brick walls darkened by decades of smoke and rain. Tall narrow windows stared down at the streets like tired eyes. Even before stepping inside, you could smell them. A heavy mixture of sickness, sweat, damp sheets, strong chemicals, and something metallic lingering faintly in the air. Blood, though no one liked saying it aloud. Most people avoided hospitals for as long as possible. You did not go there for comfort. You went because every other option had already failed. Because the fever would not break. Because the cough had turned bloody. Because the factory machine had taken 2 fingers and maybe your future along with them. For the poor especially, hospitals felt less like places of healing and more like buildings where desperate people waited nervously to discover whether they would survive the week. Inside, the wards were overcrowded. Beds stood close together in long rows beneath high ceilings stained with smoke and moisture. Patients coughed constantly. Some cried out in pain during the night. Others lay frighteningly silent beneath thin blankets while nurses hurried past carrying bowls of water already cloudy from use. Privacy barely existed. If you were sick in Victorian London, you suffered publicly. Everyone heard your coughing. Everyone saw your wounds. Everyone smelled infection spreading through the room. The sounds alone could unsettle even healthy visitors, hacking lungs, whispered prayers, distant screaming from surgical rooms somewhere deeper inside the building. And surgery was truly terrifying. Even by Victorian standards, operations inspired absolute dread. Before anesthesia became more common, patients were fully awake during procedures. Imagine being held down by several assistants while a surgeon worked as quickly as possible with saws and knives because speed mattered more than precision. The faster the operation, the greater your chance of surviving the shock. The screams from operating rooms reportedly echoed through hospital corridors. Some patients became so frightened they refused surgery entirely, choosing instead to live with pain, deformity, or slow death rather than face the knife. Anesthesia eventually improved things somewhat. Ether and chloroform allowed some patients to sleep during procedures. But even then, danger remained everywhere because hospitals themselves were deeply unsanitary places. Doctors still did not fully understand germs. A surgeon might move directly from one operation to another without properly cleaning his hands or instruments. Blood-stained aprons were sometimes worn almost proudly, viewed as symbols of experience rather than warnings of contamination. Surgical tools were reused repeatedly with little sanitation beyond a quick wipe of cloth. Infection spread rapidly. A patient might survive the surgery itself only to die days later from fever and rotting wounds. Terms like blood poisoning and hospital fever terrified families because they often meant death was already approaching. The smell inside surgical wards was unforgettable. Strong chemicals attempted to mask the deeper odors beneath: infection, sweat, sickness, and fear. Windows were sometimes opened for fresh air, though London's smoky atmosphere hardly improved conditions much. Flies buzzed through crowded rooms during warmer months. Sheets stained quickly. Water grew dirty almost immediately. Nurses worked endlessly, though conditions exhausted them as well. Many hospitals lacked proper supplies. Staff rushed constantly between patients while trying to manage outbreaks of disease within the wards themselves. At times, hospitals became dangerous places simply because so many sick people were crowded together beneath one roof. And then there were the medical students. Victorian medicine depended heavily on studying human bodies, but obtaining corpses legally proved difficult. This created one of the darkest trades in the city: grave robbing. Throughout London, body snatchers dug up freshly buried corpses and secretly sold them to anatomy schools. Families feared this deeply. Some guarded graves overnight after funerals. Others placed iron cages called mort safes over burial sites to protect loved ones from being stolen beneath cover of darkness. Imagine mourning a family member while also worrying someone might dig them back up before morning. Victorian London somehow found ways to make grief even crueler. Poor patients often felt especially powerless in hospitals. Wealthier citizens could sometimes recover at home with private doctors and cleaner surroundings. The poor had little choice except crowded charity hospitals where treatment depended heavily on luck, timing, and the skill of exhausted physicians working with limited knowledge. Child patients made the wards even sadder. Small pale children coughed weakly beneath oversized blankets while worried mothers sat nearby clutching hats in trembling hands. Diseases like scarlet fever, tuberculosis, and diphtheria swept through young bodies quickly. Many parents entered hospitals carrying hope and left carrying silence. And death was common enough that hospital workers developed frightening routines around it. Beds emptied and filled quickly. Sheets changed hands. Personal belongings were gathered quietly into small bundles. Another patient arrived before the mattress had fully cooled. Victorian London simply produced too much suffering for hospitals to pause very long. At night, hospitals felt almost ghostly. Gas lamps flickered weakly in long corridors. Shadows stretched across walls. Footsteps echoed through stairwells while distant coughing rose and fell like waves. Somewhere a patient moaned in pain. Somewhere else a doctor hurried toward another emergency with tired eyes and stained sleeves. Even surviving a hospital stay could leave lasting scars. A factory worker might lose an arm after an accident with machinery. A child surviving disease could remain weak for life. Women often faced dangerous childbirths with little reliable medical help available if complications appeared suddenly. For many Londoners, hospitals symbolized the frightening limits of Victorian medicine itself. Doctors tried desperately to help, but science had not yet caught up with the scale of suffering surrounding them. And still, every day, the sick kept arriving. Carriages rattled toward hospital entrances carrying injured workers, feverish children, exhausted mothers, and coughing old men wrapped in threadbare coats. The doors opened. The smell spilled outward into the foggy streets. And somewhere inside, another frightened patient wondered quietly whether they would ever walk back out again. Medicine in Victorian London was a strange mixture of hope, guesswork, and desperation. People desperately wanted cures. The city was filled with coughing children, feverish workers, exhausted mothers, and old men whose lungs sounded like broken machinery. Disease haunted every neighborhood. Yet despite all the suffering, real medical treatment remained painfully limited. A simple illness could become deadly with terrifying speed. Today, a sore throat might mean tea, rest, and a quick visit to the pharmacy. In Victorian London, the same sore throat could slowly close your airways while terrified relatives stood helpless beside the bed. A small cut on the hand could become infected. A cough could become pneumonia. A rotten tooth might spread infection through the body until death followed days later. The human body lived constantly on the edge of disaster. Part of the problem was that doctors still did not fully understand how disease spread. Germ theory was only beginning to emerge, and many people still believed illness came from foul air, poisonous vapors, or imbalance within the body itself. London certainly had plenty of foul air to support the theory. The city smelled diseased. Coal smoke drifted endlessly through crowded streets while sewage flowed openly beside homes and markets. Water sources became contaminated constantly. Entire families slept packed together in damp rooms where sickness spread from one coughing person to the next with brutal efficiency. But even when people understood they were ill, treatment options remained frighteningly uncertain. Victorian pharmacies looked impressive enough from the outside. Shelves lined with bottles, powders, herbs, and strange liquids promised relief from nearly every imaginable condition. Painted signs advertised miracle tonics capable of curing coughs, headaches, weakness, sadness, stomach pain, and occasionally bad luck itself. Inside many of those bottles, however, was little more than alcohol, sugar, or opium. Opium appeared everywhere in Victorian medicine. Doctors prescribed it for pain, coughing, insomnia, anxiety, diarrhea, and exhaustion. Poor mothers sometimes gave small amounts to crying babies simply because it kept them quiet long enough to survive another exhausting day. One of the most common medicines was laudanum, a mixture containing opium and alcohol. It dulled pain effectively, but addiction followed many patients quietly through the years. In some neighborhoods, people relied on it so heavily that entire households drifted through daily life half-sedated simply trying to escape discomfort. And honestly, discomfort was everywhere. Tooth pain alone could become unbearable. Dental care in Victorian London was primitive and horrifying. Dentists often pulled teeth without proper anesthesia while patients gripped chairs hard enough to nearly break their fingers. Infection spread easily through damaged gums. Some people died from abscesses that today would be treated routinely. Others simply lived with constant pain because treatment cost too much. For the poor, medicine itself often felt like a luxury reserved for wealthier citizens. A factory worker earning barely enough to buy bread could not easily afford doctors, expensive tonics, or weeks spent recovering in bed. Missing work meant losing wages, and losing wages meant hunger. So many people continued laboring while dangerously ill. You could walk through Victorian London and see disease everywhere once you knew how to recognize it. The pale young woman coughing into a cloth spotted faintly with blood. The limping dock worker hiding an infected wound beneath dirty bandages. The exhausted child with hollow eyes and feverish skin still selling newspapers because the family needed every coin. Illness became woven into daily life so completely that many stopped reacting strongly to it unless death seemed immediately close. And then there were the fake medicines. Victorian London overflowed with traveling salesmen promising miracle cures. Posters covered walls advertising magical syrups, healing powders, electric belts, herbal elixirs, and secret formulas guaranteed to restore strength or cure deadly diseases. Most accomplished absolutely nothing. Some were actively dangerous. Many contained toxic substances like mercury or arsenic. Others included massive amounts of alcohol or narcotics disguised beneath impressive scientific language. Desperate people bought them anyway because desperation makes hope incredibly valuable. Imagine suffering from tuberculosis, slowly growing weaker every month, and hearing someone claim they possess a miraculous cure hidden inside a glass bottle. You would want to believe them too. Even professional doctors often disagreed violently with one another about proper treatment. One physician might recommend bleeding a patient to remove unhealthy blood. Another prescribed rest and fresh air. A third suggested strong liquor, tonics, or strange chemical mixtures. Medical science was improving, but painfully slowly compared to the speed of disease spreading through London's overcrowded streets. Childbirth remained especially dangerous. Many women gave birth at home in cramped unsanitary rooms with limited medical help available if complications appeared. Infection after childbirth killed countless mothers. Babies often died before reaching their first birthday from illness, malnutrition, or simple bad luck. Families lived with constant uncertainty because medicine could promise very little. Parents watched fevers nervously through sleepless nights hoping the child would still be breathing by morning. Husbands stood helpless beside sick wives while doctors tried treatments that sometimes sounded more like superstition than science. Entire households feared winter because cold weather brought waves of influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. And hospitals, despite all their efforts, remained deeply frightening places. Patients' new infections spread rapidly inside crowded wards. Surgeries carried terrifying risks. A person might survive an accident only to die afterward from disease entering the wound. Without antibiotics, the body either fought infection successfully or slowly surrendered to it. Minor injuries could become nightmares. A factory worker losing skin to machinery risked gangrene. A chimney sweep scraping his leg climbing rooftops might develop deadly fever days later. Even stepping on a dirty nail in London's filthy streets could eventually lead to amputation or death. People feared sickness partly because they understood how powerless medicine often was against it. Yet despite everything, Victorian Londoners continued searching for relief. Herbal remedies passed through generations remained common. Families brewed strange teas for coughs, placed poultices over wounds, rubbed oils onto aching joints, and followed folk cures whispered between neighbors. Some remedies genuinely helped. Others simply gave frightened people the comfort of feeling they were doing something. And comfort mattered. Because illness in Victorian London was rarely only physical. Disease brought fear. Fear of missing work. Fear of starving. Fear of leaving children orphaned. Fear of slowly suffocating from tuberculosis in a tiny room while coal smoke drifted endlessly through cracked windows. The lack of reliable medicine made every sickness feel unpredictable and personal. No one truly knew who would recover and who would not. Two people might catch the same illness. One survives. The other dies within days. The randomness of it haunted the city constantly. Still, every morning London woke again. Doctors hurried through foggy streets carrying worn black bags filled with uncertain remedies. Pharmacists mixed powders beneath flickering lamps. Mothers boiled herbs beside weak fires while praying fevers would break before dawn. And millions of ordinary people continued living in a city where medicine was still struggling desperately to catch up with human suffering. Work in Victorian London did not merely exhaust people. It slowly destroyed them. Every trade carried its own special misery, its own unique way of grinding down the human body until workers became pale shadows moving through the fog. The city ran on labor, endless, brutal labor, and the people powering it often paid with their lungs, their limbs, or their lives. By sunrise, London already sounded tired. Factory whistles screamed through the smoky air while crowds of workers shuffled toward mills, workshops, shipyards, and construction sites. Boots scraped against wet cobblestones. Men coughed into rough cloths blackened with soot. Women hurried through the fog carrying lunch wrapped in paper or old fabric. Children marched beside them looking far too young for the jobs waiting ahead. No one worked because they wanted to. They worked because hunger frightened people more than exhaustion did. Factories were among the worst places to earn a living. From outside, the buildings looked enormous and powerful, their tall chimneys pouring endless smoke into the sky. Inside, they felt alive in the most unpleasant way imaginable. Machines roared constantly, shaking floors and walls alike. Belts spun overhead. Steam hissed from pipes. Metal gears turned with terrifying speed beside workers who spent entire days standing inches away from disaster. The noise never truly stopped. Imagine spending 12 or 14 hours surrounded by clanking iron, pounding engines, and screaming machinery loud enough to drown out your own thoughts. Workers often left factories partially deaf after years of labor. Some could barely hear conversations by middle age. The air inside mills and workshops was equally dangerous. Textile factories filled with floating dust and fibers that workers breathed deep into their lungs every single day. At first it caused coughing. Then tightness in the chest. Then exhaustion. Years later came the permanent damage. Breathing became difficult even while resting. Some workers sounded as though they were drowning slowly whenever they spoke. Coal workers suffered even worse. Men hauling coal through mines or unloading it along London docks inhaled black dust constantly. The particles settled deep inside their lungs where the body could not remove them properly. Over time, workers developed terrible breathing illnesses that modern people would recognize as black lung disease. Victims coughed endlessly. Thick dark mucus-stained handkerchiefs. Climbing stairs became exhausting. Some older workers could barely cross a room without stopping to gasp for air. Yet many continued laboring anyway because survival demanded it. The city consumed their lungs piece by piece. Then there were the chimney sweeps. Perhaps no image captures Victorian child labor more hauntingly than small boys climbing through narrow chimneys coated in soot. Tiny children were considered ideal for the job because their bodies could squeeze through spaces adults could not enter. Imagine being 6 or 7 years old and sent crawling upward through dark brick tunnels filled with ash, smoke residue, and sharp corners tearing at your skin. Some children became trapped inside chimneys and suffocated slowly in complete darkness. Others developed horrific respiratory illnesses from years spent inhaling soot. Many chimney sweeps eventually suffered a rare and deadly cancer caused directly by constant exposure to smoke and chemicals. Victorian doctors noticed the pattern long before they fully understood why it happened. Entire lives poisoned simply by cleaning other people's fireplaces. And still, the work continued. Factory girls faced their own nightmare conditions. Match factories were especially feared. Young women and girls spent long hours working with white phosphorus, a toxic chemical used in match production. Day after day they inhaled dangerous fumes while handling chemicals with bare hands. Eventually some workers developed a horrifying condition known as phossy jaw. Their teeth rotted painfully. Gums swelled and decayed. Bones inside the jaw began dying slowly, causing terrible pain and a foul smell that followed victims constantly. In severe cases, pieces of jawbone literally glowed faintly in the dark because of phosphorus contamination. Imagine going to work each day knowing your job was quietly eating away your face. Dock workers suffered differently. The London docks never slept for long. Ships arrived constantly carrying goods from across the British Empire: tea, sugar, cotton, tobacco, spices, timber, coal. Workers unloaded cargo in freezing rain, thick fog, or crushing summer heat. The labor destroyed backs, shoulders, and knees. Men hauled enormous loads until their bodies simply wore down. Accidents happened constantly. Crates slipped loose from ropes. Heavy cargo crushed limbs. Workers fell into freezing river water between ships and docks. And if injury prevented you from working, there was usually no safety net waiting beneath you. No compensation. No guaranteed support. A broken leg could push an entire family toward starvation. Construction workers faced similar dangers while helping build the rapidly expanding city. Victorian London constantly seemed under construction. Railways cut through neighborhoods. Bridges rose over filthy water. New factories and apartment buildings climbed upward into the smoky skyline. The work was dangerous beyond belief. Scaffolding collapsed. Tools fell from great heights. Men slipped from rooftops wet with rain and soot. Safety regulations barely existed, and employers often valued speed more highly than worker protection. Some laborers simply vanished from work sites one day and never returned. Then there were the seamstresses. At first glance, sewing appeared safer than factory machinery or coal dust. But the work destroyed people in quieter ways. Women sat bent over cloth for endless hours inside dim crowded rooms with poor ventilation and weak candlelight. Eyes strained constantly. Fingers bled from needles. Backs curved painfully from years spent hunched over tables. Many survived on almost no sleep during busy seasons, sewing late into the night simply to earn enough money for rent and food. Exhaustion became permanent. The city ran on overworked bodies. Even street jobs carried hidden dangers. Crossing sweepers spent entire days outside breathing smoke and cold air. Street vendors pushed heavy carts through crowded roads in every weather imaginable. Cab drivers sat for hours in freezing fog while rain soaked through coats already worn thin from years of use. And everywhere came the coughing. The endless coughing. Victorian London sounded sick because its workers were sick. The air itself damaged people. Coal smoke settled deep into lungs already weakened by long hours, poor nutrition, and overcrowded living conditions. By middle age, many laborers looked decades older than they truly were. Faces lined early. Teeth damaged. Skin gray with soot and exhaustion. Doctors began noticing patterns. Certain jobs seemed to produce certain illnesses. Chimney sweeps developed cancer. Factory workers suffered breathing problems. Dock laborers aged rapidly from physical strain. But understanding the problem and fixing it were very different things. Industry made powerful people wealthy. Workers remained replaceable. If one laborer became too sick to continue, another desperate person usually waited nearby ready to take the position immediately. London's population kept growing, and poverty-insured employers rarely lacked workers willing to risk their health for wages. Children suffered worst of all. Tiny boys crawled beneath dangerous machinery to clean moving parts because adults could not fit. Young girls carried heavy loads that bent their growing bodies painfully. Some children worked so long and so hard that they seemed to skip childhood entirely, transforming directly from exhausted little workers into exhausted adults. And yet despite all this suffering, people still found moments of humanity inside the misery. Workers joked together during breaks. Shared bread. Helped injured friends home after accidents. Sang songs in workshops to make endless labor slightly more bearable. Human beings have always possessed a remarkable ability to survive terrible conditions while still searching stubbornly for small moments of warmth. But the truth remained unavoidable. Victorian London did not simply use workers. It consumed them. Slowly. Relentlessly. One breath of coal smoke at a time. The River Thames was the heart of Victorian London. And it was also one of the filthiest, most horrifying places in the entire city. Everything eventually found its way into the river. Sewage. Dead animals. Rotting food. Factory chemicals. Slaughterhouse waste. Smoke-blackened runoff from the streets. And sometimes, disturbingly often, human bodies. The Thames carried the entire city upon its back while simultaneously drowning beneath the weight of London's endless waste. During the day, the river looked busy and alive. Cargo ships crowded the water beside fishing boats, ferries, and barges stacked high with coal or timber. Dock workers shouted across the fog while cranes groaned under enormous loads. The empire flowed through this river. Tea from India. Sugar from the Caribbean. Cotton, tobacco, spices, silk. But beneath the noise and movement lurked something deeply unhealthy. The water itself had turned thick and foul. In some places, it barely seemed like water anymore. The surface shimmered strangely beneath layers of grease, filth, and floating debris. Dead fish drifted belly up beside bits of garbage and patches of foam whose origin no one wanted to investigate too carefully. The smell was impossible to ignore. Even from several streets away, the river announced itself. A heavy sour stench rolled through nearby neighborhoods, especially during summer when heat baked the filth beneath the sun. Imagine the smell of sewage left standing for weeks, mixed with rotting meat, industrial smoke, dead animals, and stagnant water. Then imagine millions of people simply trying to continue daily life beside it. Some mornings, the fog rising from the Thames carried the smell directly into the city. Londoners woke coughing while foul river air crept through windows and alleyways like a living thing. And yet people still depended on the Thames for survival. That was the true horror. Water companies pulled drinking water directly from the river, sometimes only a short distance from where sewage emptied into it. Entire neighborhoods unknowingly drank contaminated water every single day. Families boiled what they could, but coal cost money, and not everyone could afford enough fuel to purify every bucket. Then came cholera. The disease swept through Victorian London like a nightmare. Victims suffered violent cramps, vomiting, and terrible dehydration. Healthy people could become weak corpses within days or even hours. Entire households panicked when the illness appeared nearby. At first, many doctors blamed bad air or foul smells drifting from the river itself. In fairness, the Thames certainly smelled murderous enough to support the theory. But eventually physicians like John Snow began noticing a terrifying connection between cholera outbreaks and contaminated water sources. People were drinking death directly from the river. Still, change came painfully slowly. London kept growing faster than its infrastructure. More factories appeared every year. More waste poured into the Thames. More crowded neighborhoods emptied sewage directly into the water through primitive drains and open channels. At low tide, parts of the riverbank became almost unbearable to look at. Mud blackened with industrial waste stretched outward beneath swarms of flies. Rotting debris collected in thick layers along the shore. Rats darted between broken crates and dead animals tangled in reeds. Sometimes workers discovered bodies washed against the banks after disappearing into the city days earlier. The Thames had a frightening habit of returning what London tried to hide. Children living near the river sometimes scavenged through the mud searching for coins, scraps of metal, or anything valuable enough to sell. These mudlarks, as they became known, wandered through filth from sunrise until darkness hoping to earn enough for bread. Imagine being so poor that searching a poisonous riverbank for garbage becomes honest work. And still, thousands depended on the docks for survival. Dock workers spent long exhausting days unloading ships in freezing rain and thick fog while breathing the smell of the river constantly. Their boots sank into mud mixed with sewage and industrial runoff. Cuts and scrapes became dangerous because infection thrived in the polluted water. Some laborers fell into the Thames accidentally and emerged coated in filth so foul people claimed the smell lingered for days afterward. Others never resurfaced at all. At night, the river became even more unsettling. Fog drifted low across the black water while gas lamps flickered weakly along the embankments. Shapes moved silently through the mist. Barges creaked against wooden docks. Somewhere distant came the sound of chains rattling or drunken singing echoing across the water. The Thames at night felt less like part of a civilized city and more like something ancient and hungry waiting beneath the fog. Criminals used the river often. Smugglers slipped through darkness unnoticed. Thieves vanished into riverside alleys. Rumors spread constantly about bodies dumped quietly into the water under cover of night. Some stories were exaggerated. Others almost certainly were not. Then came one of the most infamous moments in Victorian London history, the Great Stink of 1858. That summer, intense heat turned the Thames into what many described as an open sewer baking beneath the sun. The smell became so overwhelming that people struggled to work near the river at all. Curtains soaked in chemicals were hung around government buildings in desperate attempts to block the odor. Members of Parliament reportedly considered abandoning meetings because the smell drifting through the city became unbearable even indoors. For once, the filth could no longer be ignored by the wealthy. The Great Stink finally forced serious efforts to improve London's sewer system. Massive engineering projects began redirecting waste away from the heart of the city. Slowly, painfully slowly, conditions improved over the following decades. But during much of the Victorian era, the Thames remained both lifeline and poison. The river carried trade, wealth, and opportunity into London while simultaneously spreading disease and filth through the city's veins. It reflected Victorian London perfectly, powerful, overcrowded, ambitious, and dangerously unhealthy beneath the surface. And every evening, as fog rolled once more across the dark water and factory smoke drifted over the skyline, the Thames continued flowing silently through the center of the empire, carrying all of London's secrets with it. For many poor families in Victorian London, there was something even more frightening than disease, hunger, or the endless factory smoke. It was the workhouse. The very word carried shame heavy enough to silence a room. People whispered it carefully, the same way others whispered about prisons or graveyards. Because once you entered a workhouse, the world often treated you as though you had failed not only financially, but morally. Poverty in Victorian England was seen by many wealthy people as a kind of personal weakness, something to be punished rather than helped. And so the city built enormous institutions designed less for comfort and more for discouragement. From the outside, workhouses looked cold and severe. Tall brick buildings surrounded by iron gates. Narrow windows staring blankly over muddy streets. Chimneys pouring smoke into gray skies. They resembled factories mixed with prisons, which in many ways they were. Families approached them with dread. You only entered a workhouse when every other option had disappeared. When rent could no longer be paid. When illness stole your ability to work. When there was no bread left, no coal for the fire, and no relatives willing or able to help. Crossing those gates meant surrendering much of your old life behind you. The first cruelty came immediately. Families were separated. Husbands sent one direction. Wives another. Children taken elsewhere entirely. Officials believed poor people would become too comfortable if families remained together, so separation itself became part of the punishment. Imagine watching your children disappear down a corridor while you are ordered elsewhere, unsure when you might see them again. Some parents described the experience as worse than hunger itself. Inside, life followed strict rules. Bells controlled the day. Bells for waking. Bells for eating. Bells for labor. Bells for silence. Everything moved according to routine because routine was considered morally improving. The meals were miserable. Thin gruel. Dry bread. Weak soup. Tiny portions served in large echoing halls where hundreds ate together beneath the watchful eyes of supervisors. Hunger never fully disappeared. The food was intentionally plain because authorities feared anything too comfortable might encourage dependence on public assistance. Children often remained hungry constantly. The dormitories were cold and overcrowded. Rows of narrow beds filled large rooms smelling faintly of soap, damp fabric, sickness, and exhausted bodies. Blankets were rough and thin. Privacy barely existed. Coughing echoed endlessly through the night while rain tapped against windows blackened by smoke from the city outside. And work never stopped for long. Men broke stones, crushed bones for fertilizer, or performed exhausting manual labor. Women scrubbed laundry until their hands cracked and bled in cold water. Elderly residents worked as long as their bodies allowed because idleness was considered dangerous. Even children were expected to contribute. Some learned basic trades. Others cleaned floors, carried supplies, sorted materials, or performed whatever labor the institution required. Childhood inside a workhouse often felt frighteningly short. The orphanages were not much kinder. Victorian London produced thousands of orphaned or abandoned children. Disease killed parents regularly. Factory accidents left families destroyed overnight. Poverty forced desperate mothers to surrender children they simply could no longer feed. The streets themselves became filled with homeless boys and girls surviving however they could. Selling flowers. Sweeping crossings. Carrying messages. Stealing when necessary. Sleeping beneath bridges or inside abandoned buildings during winter. Charitable orphanages claimed to rescue such children from the streets, but conditions varied enormously. Some institutions genuinely tried to help. Others resembled factories for producing obedient workers. The children wore identical plain clothing. Ate simple meals. Slept in long crowded dormitories beneath the supervision of exhausted caretakers. Discipline remained strict because large groups of poor children were often viewed with suspicion, almost like potential criminals waiting to happen. Many children grew up surrounded by silence instead of affection. There were too many mouths to feed and too many beds to fill for warmth or comfort to exist in abundance. Caretakers focused on order, cleanliness, obedience, survival. Love became a luxury the institution could rarely afford. Punishments were harsh. Children who stole food might be beaten or isolated. Talking after lights out brought consequences. Laziness, rudeness, fighting, everything carried penalties because Victorian society believed discipline created moral citizens. Sometimes it simply created frightened children. Disease spread quickly through orphanages and workhouses just as it did everywhere else in the city. One fever could move through entire dormitories within days. Tuberculosis lingered constantly in overcrowded sleeping rooms. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems already struggling against London's smoke-filled air and endless dampness. Death visited these institutions regularly. A child disappeared from the dining hall one morning and another quietly took the empty seat by evening. Life continued because there were always more hungry people waiting outside the gates. Victorian London moved too quickly and harshly to pause long for grief. Yet even in these bleak places, moments of humanity survived stubbornly. Children whispered stories beneath blankets after dark. Older residents shared scraps of bread with weaker neighbors. Friendships formed quietly during endless hours of labor. A caretaker occasionally slipped an extra spoonful of soup to a starving child when supervisors were not looking. Small acts of kindness became powerful things in places built around hardship. Outside the workhouse walls, ordinary Londoners feared ending up there themselves. The sight of those buildings haunted the poor constantly because almost anyone could fall into desperation after illness, injury, or unemployment. One factory accident. One brutal winter. One unpaid rent payment. That was often all it took. And so people worked through sickness. Hid hunger. Stayed in dangerous jobs. Endured impossible conditions simply to avoid the shame and terror of the workhouse gates closing behind them. For many Victorians, the workhouse represented more than poverty. It represented losing control over your own life entirely. And yet despite all the suffering, people endured. Children still laughed occasionally in courtyards between chores. Mothers separated from families still kept hope alive quietly inside themselves. Elderly laborers still shared stories about better days beside weak fires during cold evenings. Because even in the harshest corners of Victorian London, human beings continued searching stubbornly for warmth, dignity, and connection beneath skies permanently darkened by smoke. And yet despite the smoke, the sickness, the hunger, and the endless exhaustion, millions of people endured Victorian London every single day. They woke before sunrise in freezing rooms with cracked walls and damp blankets. They stepped into streets thick with fog and coal smoke. They worked until their hands bled, their backs ached, and their lungs burned with every breath. They buried children too young to understand the world. They survived illnesses modern medicine would cure in days. They watched the river carry filth through the heart of the city while factories darkened the sky above them. And still, somehow, life continued. Market vendors still shouted cheerfully through the fog. Workers still laughed together during short breaks beside roaring machines. Mothers still sang tired lullabies while rain tapped softly against soot-covered windows. Young couples still fell in love beneath gas lamps glowing faintly through the mist. Because even in one of the harshest cities on earth, people remained stubbornly human. Victorian London was cruel. It was overcrowded, dangerous, diseased, and relentlessly exhausting. But it was also alive in a way few places have ever been. Millions of ordinary people carried the weight of the empire on tired shoulders while asking for almost nothing in return except the chance to survive another winter. History often remembers the grand names. The queens, inventors, politicians, and wealthy industrialists. But the real story of Victorian London belonged to the ordinary people hidden beneath the smoke. The dock workers breathing river fog before dawn. The seamstresses sewing by candlelight until midnight. The chimney sweeps climbing through soot-black tunnels. The children carrying matches through crowded streets. The mothers stretching scraps of bread to feed entire families. They were the beating heart of the city. And perhaps that is what makes Victorian London so haunting even now. Not merely the filth or the suffering, but the resilience. The quiet determination of millions who kept going despite impossible conditions. So tonight, as you settle into a warm bed far from the choking fog of 19th century London, spare a thought for those forgotten lives. For the workers, the widows, the orphaned children, and the exhausted families who endured one of history's harshest cities one cold day at a time. Because beneath all the smoke and misery, Victorian London was still filled with people dreaming of something better. And in many ways, that hope was the only thing powerful enough to outlive the fog. And after everything you've already endured in Victorian London, the smoke, the sickness, the freezing rooms, the endless coughing, the hunger that gnaws like a rat inside your stomach, you begin to understand something deeply unsettling. Honest work is not guaranteed to save you. You can wake before sunrise every day. You can break your back unloading cargo by the Thames, so your fingers raw in a candlelit factory, or spend 14 hours breathing coal dust beside roaring machines. And still, at the end of the week, you might not earn enough to eat properly. The landlord still knocks. The winter still arrives. Your little brother still coughs blood into a rag beside the fireplace. So eventually, for many Londoners, survival starts bending morality into strange new shapes. Because crime in Victorian London is not always about greed. Very often, it's simply about staying alive. The city after dark feels completely different. Daytime London is crowded and noisy, filled with shouting vendors, clattering wagons, and factory smoke drifting above endless rooftops. But nighttime London belongs to shadows. Gas lamps flicker weakly through thick fog, barely lighting the streets at all. Alleyways become black tunnels between leaning buildings. Footsteps echo strangely through the mist. Somewhere distant, drunken laughter spills from a gin house while church bells ring softly over the rooftops. And somewhere nearby, someone is watching your pockets. Pickpockets thrive in Victorian London because crowds are everywhere. Markets, bridges, train stations, music halls, perfect places to disappear into human traffic. A gentle bump. A quick hand. Your coin purse vanishes before you even realize someone touched you. The skilled thieves are called dippers. Some work alone. Others move in teams. One distracts you while another lifts the wallet. Children are especially useful because no one expects a thin hungry 12-year-old to rob them blind beside a fruit stall. And many of those children are desperate enough to do exactly that. Some Victorian children learn to steal before they learn to read. Hunger is a brutal teacher. An orphan sleeping beneath bridges cannot survive on morality alone. You see them everywhere once you start looking closely. Barefoot boys darting through crowded streets. Young girls selling flowers during the day and lifting watches at night. Tiny hands slipping through coat pockets faster than most adults can react. Some children work for gangs. Others simply work for themselves because starvation leaves little room for innocence. Charles Dickens turned these street children into famous fictional characters. Real life is less charming. Real life ends in prison cells, disease, or quiet deaths during winter nights cold enough to freeze puddles solid. And prisons are terrifying places. Newgate Prison looms over London like a nightmare made of stone. Dark walls. Iron bars. Overcrowded cells packed with sickness, violence, and despair. The smell alone reportedly overwhelms visitors: sweat, sewage, damp straw, sickness, and fear trapped together beneath heavy ceilings. Some criminals are imprisoned. Others are transported across the ocean to penal colonies in Australia, effectively erased from the city entirely. Imagine stealing bread in London and ending your life on the other side of the world simply because hunger became stronger than obedience. Still, the risk often feels worth it. Because legal work can kill you just as effectively as crime does. It simply happens more slowly. Women facing poverty often have even fewer choices. Some become fences, secretly buying and selling stolen goods from cramped back rooms hidden behind ordinary storefronts. Others run lodging houses where criminals hide from police while the fog blankets the streets outside. And many women, especially widows or abandoned mothers, are pushed toward prostitution simply to survive. Victorian London speaks endlessly about morality while quietly forcing thousands into impossible situations. The city judges harshly but feeds poorly. Meanwhile, scams and swindles flourish everywhere. Street gamblers lure crowds with fast-moving card tricks beneath gas lamps. Vendors water down milk or sell spoiled meat hidden beneath heavy seasoning. Fake miracle medicines promise impossible cures to desperate people already weakened by sickness and exhaustion. Everyone is trying to survive someone else. Even the dead are not always safe. One of the most disturbing professions in Victorian London belongs to the resurrection men, body snatchers who dig up fresh graves under cover of darkness and sell corpses illegally to medical schools. Imagine mourning your loved one while worrying someone might steal the body before sunrise. Families sometimes guard graves themselves for days after funerals because the trade is profitable enough to attract desperate men carrying shovels through midnight fog. The city finds ways to turn even death into business. And what about the police? Well, they exist. Technically, the Metropolitan Police Force is still relatively new during much of the Victorian era. Officers known as bobbies patrol the streets carrying whistles, batons, and very little real protection. Some are honest men trying to keep order in a city expanding faster than anyone can properly control. Others are exhausted, underpaid, or quietly corrupt. London is simply too enormous, too crowded, and too chaotic to police effectively. Fog hides criminals beautifully. Narrow alleyways twist through poor neighborhoods like mazes. Entire districts become dangerous after dark. If trouble finds you in the wrong street at the wrong hour, help may never arrive at all. And then there is Whitechapel. Even before the infamous murders later associated with Jack the Ripper, London's East End already terrified respectable citizens. Overcrowded lodging houses packed entire families into single rooms. Drunken fights spilled from gin shops into muddy streets. Women walked quickly through the fog after dark while constantly checking behind them. The newspapers love it. Victorian papers feast upon crime stories with endless enthusiasm. Murders, robberies, scandals, gang violence, fear sells copies beautifully. Every shocking headline deepens the sense that London itself is becoming too large and dangerous to fully understand anymore. But beneath all the crime and fear lies something painfully simple. Desperation. Most criminals in Victorian London are not criminal masterminds. They're hungry. Cold. Cornered by circumstances. A dock worker injured on the job with no money left. A widow trying to feed children after her husband dies from tuberculosis. An orphan with nowhere to sleep except alleyways already claimed by gangs. When survival becomes uncertain, morality begins feeling like a luxury item reserved for wealthier people. And after everything you've seen in this city, perhaps that's the most frightening truth of all. Victorian London doesn't merely create crime. It manufactures desperation on an industrial scale. The same city building grand museums and glittering theaters also produces starving children willing to steal bread beneath gas lamps glowing through poisoned fog. The same empire ruling vast parts of the world cannot provide clean water, safe housing, or honest survival for millions living at its center. And yet every night, the city continues breathing. Carriages rattle through the mist. Police whistles echo faintly through distant streets. Pickpockets vanish into crowds. Factory workers stumble home exhausted while criminals begin their own long shifts beneath the darkness. London never truly sleeps. It coughs, steals, starves, survives. And somewhere beneath the endless smoke and fog, millions of ordinary people continue searching desperately for warmth, safety, and one more chance to make it through tomorrow. You learn quickly in Victorian London to keep one hand over your pocket and the other close to your ribs. Not because you're wealthy. Quite the opposite. If you've got enough money for bread, somebody nearby probably wants it more than you do. The streets around Covent Garden are already packed before noon. Workers push through the crowds with tired faces and soot-black coats. Women argue over cabbage prices beside carts dripping muddy water onto the stones. Horses shove through the fog pulling wagons heavy with coal and beer barrels. Somewhere nearby, a man is shouting about hot eel pies while another swears his boots were stolen 10 minutes ago. And in the middle of all that noise and chaos, somebody bumps into you. Just lightly. Barely enough to notice. An apology follows immediately. A small boy. Thin face. Flat cap pulled low over sharp eyes. He looks maybe 11. Maybe younger. Hard to tell in London. Hunger makes children look old. Then he's gone. And so is your coin purse. You check your pocket too late. Empty. Welcome to Victorian London. You could shout for help, of course. But the crowd barely notices anymore. Pickpockets are everywhere. Markets, bridges, train stations, music halls, pubs. Anywhere people gather tightly enough to stop paying attention. And the strangest part is this, most thieves aren't hardened criminals. They're children. Tiny boys with quick fingers and hollow stomachs. Girls wrapped in oversized shawls moving silently through crowds like drifting smoke. Some are orphans. Some still have families waiting in freezing rooms somewhere nearby. Others work for gangs who train them young because children attract less suspicion. You start noticing them everywhere once you know what to look for. A barefoot child pretending to sleep beside a wall while secretly watching pockets. Two girls distracting a drunk sailor while a third quietly lifts his watch chain. A boy offering to clean boots while his friend searches your coat from behind. They're fast because they have to be. Get caught stealing in Victorian London and life becomes dangerous very quickly. Police officers, bobbies, patrol the streets carrying batons and very little patience. Some children end up beaten. Others disappear into prison cells that smell of damp straw, sickness, and human misery. But prison is tomorrow's problem. Hunger is today's. And hunger always wins first. You see it in their faces. These children don't steal for excitement. They steal because the city has taught them survival before kindness. Some haven't eaten properly in days. Some sleep beneath bridges or inside overcrowded lodging houses where strangers snore inches from their faces. Some hand every stolen coin directly to older gang leaders waiting in nearby alleys. The fog helps them enormously. At night, London turns into a maze of shadows and weak gaslight. Alleyways disappear into darkness. Footsteps echo strangely through the mist. You hear movement behind you constantly but rarely see anyone clearly. Perfect conditions for thieves. And honestly, you're careful too. You walk faster after dark. Keep your money hidden inside your coat lining. Avoid certain streets entirely if possible. Everyone in London knows somebody who got robbed near Whitechapel or beaten outside a gin shop or followed through the fog by figures they couldn't quite see properly. The city teaches suspicion the same way factories teach exhaustion. Daily. Relentlessly. Sometimes the child thieves work alone. Sometimes in groups. You watch one operation happen near the market almost by accident. A young girl crashes into a wealthy-looking man carrying packages. He turns angrily toward her just long enough for another boy to cut the purse strings from his coat. By the time the gentleman realizes what's happened, both children have vanished into the crowd completely. Smooth. Fast. Practiced. Like factory work. Because for many children, crime is work. There are no childhood dreams here. No safe little bedrooms. No warm schoolhouses waiting nearby. Victorian London burns innocence away early. A child learns quickly whether they're going to starve honestly or survive dishonestly. And after everything you've seen in this city, the workhouses, the sickness, the endless cold rooms smelling of coal smoke and damp blankets, you almost stop judging them entirely. Almost. Because one night, walking home through thick fog near the river, you feel another hand slip toward your pocket. This time you catch the wrist. It's a little girl. Tiny thing. Couldn't be older than 9. Her face is pale beneath the soot. Her coat hangs off her shoulders like it belonged to someone else first. For one strange second neither of you moves. Then you notice how frightened she looks. Not frightened of punishment. Frightened of failing. Because somewhere nearby, somebody is probably waiting for that money. A gang leader. A drunken parent. A younger brother with an empty stomach. The girl jerks free and disappears into the fog before you can say anything. And you're left standing alone beneath the gas lamps wondering which is worse, the fact that children steal in Victorian London, or the fact that the city has made it necessary. You learn very quickly in Victorian London that crowds are dangerous. Not riots. Not protests. Just ordinary crowds. A busy market. A packed bridge. A train station wrapped in fog and noise. That's where your money disappears. That's where tiny hands slip through coats faster than your brain can react. You feel the first attempt near Spitalfields Market. Someone bumps your shoulder hard enough to make you turn around. A woman complains loudly behind you. A cart driver starts shouting at his horse. Everything happens at once. Confusing. Loud. Chaotic. And while you're distracted, a hand slides toward your pocket. Small hand. Child's hand. You catch it just in time. The boy staring up at you looks about 10 years old, though London has a habit of making children look older than they are. His face is grey beneath the soot. His sleeves are too short. His eyes move constantly, scanning the crowd for danger even while you hold his wrist. Then he twists free and bolts into the fog before you can say a word. Gone in seconds. That's Victorian London. The city is overflowing with child thieves because the city is overflowing with hungry children. Some have parents. Some don't. Some belong to gangs who train them young because small bodies move easily through crowds and nobody expects a starving little boy to rob them blind beside a bakery stall. You start noticing them everywhere after that. Near London Bridge pretending to sell flowers. Around train platforms carrying newspapers. Sleeping beside walls with one eye half open watching pockets pass by. They're quick because they have to be. A child caught stealing might end up beaten in the street, dragged to prison, or locked inside a workhouse so miserable it practically teaches crime better than the gangs do. But hunger is immediate. Hunger doesn't wait politely for moral decisions. And London is always hungry. You see children digging through rubbish piles behind markets searching for bruised fruit or stale bread. You see boys fighting stray dogs over scraps of meat tossed from butcher shops. You see girls no older than 12 carrying babies through the fog while begging strangers for pennies beside gin houses glowing warm against the darkness. So when stealing becomes an option, many take it. Honestly, what else is left? Factory work destroys your lungs. Chimney sweeping kills children slowly with soot and sickness. Workhouses split families apart behind iron gates. Sometimes crime looks less like wickedness and more like survival wearing a flat cap. The pickpockets work in teams often. You notice the patterns eventually. One child distracts you while another steals. A young girl crashes into your coat while her partner cuts your purse strings with a tiny blade sharp as a razor. Sometimes older criminals stand nearby pretending not to watch while children do the dangerous part. If the child gets caught, well, people tend to pity children more than adults. At least sometimes they do. Other Londoners show no mercy at all. You've seen grown men grab boys by the collar and shake them hard enough to rattle their teeth loose. You've heard women scream for police after catching tiny girls stealing handkerchiefs. Poverty makes people cruel because everyone feels frightened of becoming poorer themselves. And then there are the gangs. The real gangs. Not romantic street rogues from penny novels. Real criminal crews controlling certain alleys and neighborhoods. Some recruit children directly from orphanages and lodging houses. Feed them. Shelter them. Then send them into crowds to steal for the group. The children hand over most of what they take. Maybe all of it. You hear stories about gang leaders beating young thieves who return empty-handed. Stories about children sleeping 6 to a room beneath staircases while older criminals drink gin upstairs counting stolen watches and purses beneath candlelight. Nobody is truly safe in Victorian London after dark. The fog changes everything at night. Gas lamps glow weakly through the smoke, barely lighting the streets at all. Buildings loom like shadows. Footsteps echo strangely behind you. Somewhere nearby, laughter spills drunkenly from a pub while another sound, running feet, disappears into an alley too narrow to follow. You walk faster without realizing it. Everyone does. Keep your wallet hidden. Avoid quiet streets. Don't trust strangers who stand too close. Don't stop for arguments that aren't your business. And above all, don't look wealthy, even accidentally. Because desperation watches constantly in this city. One freezing evening near Whitechapel, you see a boy trying to steal bread from a bakery cart. Not money. Not jewelry. Bread. The baker catches him instantly. For a moment, the whole street pauses. Fog drifts between the gas lamps while the child struggles weakly in the man's grip. He's painfully thin. Tiny beneath the oversized coat hanging from his shoulders. And then something strange happens. Nobody looks angry. Tired, maybe. Sad. But not surprised. Because everyone standing there understands the same thing. In Victorian London, hunger can turn almost anyone into a thief eventually. The baker sighs heavily, tears the loaf in half, and shoves the boy away instead of calling the police. The child runs immediately, disappearing into the mist, clutching the bread against his chest like treasure. And nobody says a word. Because deep down, everyone knows the truth. Victorian London doesn't just create criminals. It creates desperation so deep that even children learn to survive with quick fingers and faster feet long before they ever get the chance to simply be children. You stop walking through Whitechapel after dark if you can help it. Not because the streets are empty. Quite the opposite. The East End of Victorian London never truly sleeps. Even late at night, the alleys still breathe with noise and movement. Drunken voices spill from gin houses glowing dimly through the fog. Dock workers stumble home exhausted beneath weak gas lamps. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries through the thin walls of an overcrowded lodging house while horses clatter slowly over wet cobblestones. And hanging over everything is fear. Not ordinary fear. Not the simple fear of pickpockets or drunken fights or another freezing winter. This feels different. Sharper. Colder. Because now people whisper about a killer moving through the fog. You hear the stories everywhere. In crowded pubs beside the river. In markets where women lower their voices before saying certain names aloud. In newspaper stands where terrified headlines sell faster than bread. Every conversation eventually circles back to Whitechapel. Another body discovered. Another alley stained with panic. Another woman dead before sunrise. And nobody knows who will be next. The newspapers call him Jack the Ripper. Even the name sounds unnatural. Like something invented specifically to haunt the city. The East End was already one of the harshest places in London long before the murders began. Narrow streets packed with poverty. Lodging houses overflowing with desperate people. Women walking alone at night because survival leaves little room for safety. The fog makes everything worse. It curls around gas lamps until the streets seem underwater. Buildings fade into shadow. Footsteps echo strangely from places you can't quite see. Some nights the mist grows so thick you can barely recognize a face standing 10 feet away. Perfect conditions for fear. Perfect conditions for a killer. You notice how differently people move now. Women walk faster through the darkness, coats pulled tightly around themselves while constantly glancing over their shoulders. Men linger nervously outside pubs discussing rumors in low voices. Shopkeepers bolt doors earlier than before. Even the police seem uneasy. Especially the police. The bobbies patrol endlessly through Whitechapel carrying whistles and batons, but the city feels too large, too crowded, too tangled in fog and shadows to control properly. Every alley leads somewhere dark. Every doorway might hide someone dangerous. And Londoners are furious because the killer keeps escaping. You read the newspapers by weak candlelight in your rented room upstairs while rain taps against the window. The articles grow more dramatic every day. Some claim the murderer is a doctor. Others insist he's a butcher, a sailor, a foreigner, a madman, even a gentleman hiding behind expensive clothes. Everyone has theories. Nobody has answers. That's what truly terrifies the city. Not simply the murders themselves, but the feeling that the killer could be anyone. The polite man standing beside you at the market. The quiet figure disappearing into fog ahead. The stranger sitting silently at the end of the pub nursing a drink beneath flickering gaslight. Victorian London already feels dangerous before Jack the Ripper. Afterward, the darkness itself begins to feel alive. You start hearing stories constantly. A woman swears she saw someone following her near Commercial Street. A dock worker claims he heard screams vanish suddenly into the mist beside the river. Someone else insists the police arrested the wrong man. Another says the killer escaped dressed like a respectable gentleman while officers searched only the poor. Fear spreads faster than facts. And Whitechapel is already exhausted. The East End suffers beneath crushing poverty long before the murders. Families crowd into single filthy rooms. Disease moves through lodging houses packed wall to wall with coughing strangers. Children sleep beneath staircases while drunken arguments echo through thin walls all night long. Many women have almost no safe way to survive. Some work endless factory hours for miserable wages. Others clean houses, sew clothes, scrub laundry until their hands crack from cold water. And many turn to prostitution because hunger does not care about respectability. The newspapers rarely mention that part kindly. Victorian society judges poor women harshly while quietly forcing them into impossible choices. The same city horrified by violence often ignores the suffering already surrounding these women long before the murders begin. But now suddenly the wealthy pay attention to Whitechapel. Reporters flood the East End searching for stories. Crowds gather near crime scenes. Police officers move through the fog beneath public pressure growing heavier every week. London becomes obsessed. And still the killer remains unseen. That's the true nightmare. Victorian London already feels like a city built from shadows, smoke, and exhaustion. Jack the Ripper simply turns those shadows into something personal. Something hunting. Even people far from Whitechapel begin locking doors earlier at night. Mothers warn daughters not to walk alone. Men grip canes tighter while crossing dark streets. Every unfamiliar sound suddenly feels suspicious. A footstep behind you. A figure waiting beneath a gas lamp. A silhouette disappearing into the fog too quickly. The city starts imagining danger everywhere because maybe danger really is everywhere now. And perhaps the strangest part is this: life still continues. Factory whistles still scream before dawn. Markets still open beneath gray skies. Children still sell newspapers carrying headlines about terror through streets already filled with hunger and sickness. Because Victorian London cannot stop simply because people are afraid. The empire keeps moving. But beneath all the noise and smoke, the fear remains. Quiet. Constant. Lingering in the fog long after midnight while the East End waits nervously for morning to arrive again. You don't exactly feel safer when you see a policeman in Victorian London. Relieved, maybe. Slightly less doomed, perhaps. But safe? Not really. Because the city is simply too large, too crowded, and too chaotic for anyone to control properly. London keeps growing faster than the people trying to police it. Every week seems to bring more factories, more smoke, more crowded streets, more desperate people arriving from the countryside searching for work that barely exists. The result is a city that feels alive in the most exhausting possible way. Loud. Dirty. Restless. And somewhere inside all that confusion, a lone policeman walks his nightly beat carrying a wooden baton, a whistle, and probably several regrets. The police officers are called bobbies. Named after Sir Robert Peel, the man responsible for creating London's Metropolitan Police. At least officially. Unofficially, most Londoners just call them nosy men in funny helmets who arrive 5 minutes after the trouble ends. You see them everywhere once night falls. Slow figures moving through the fog beneath weak gas lamps. Boots scraping over wet cobblestones. Heavy dark coats shiny with rain and soot. Some carry lanterns that barely push back the darkness at all. Others walk alone for hours through neighborhoods where even the rats seem aggressive. Honestly, the job looks miserable. A Victorian policeman spends most nights dealing with drunken fights outside gin houses, thieves darting through alleyways, missing children, domestic arguments echoing through overcrowded buildings, and the occasional body discovered near the river before sunrise. And that's on a quiet evening. The East End especially feels impossible to police properly. Whitechapel after dark is a maze of narrow streets, crowded lodging houses, hidden courtyards, and endless fog drifting between leaning buildings. Thousands of desperately poor people live packed together in conditions so overcrowded that entire families sleep in single rooms beside strangers coughing through the night. Trying to control crime there feels like trying to sweep smoke out of the sky. You watch policemen patrol those streets sometimes, and even they look nervous. One officer alone beneath the gas lamps. Footsteps echoing somewhere behind him. Voices drifting from alleyways too dark to see clearly. Somewhere nearby, somebody screams, then laughs, then goes silent. London plays tricks on your nerves after midnight. The police force itself is still relatively new, which means plenty of people don't trust it yet. Older Londoners remember when neighborhoods handled problems themselves or relied on private watchmen. Some see the bobbies as protectors. Others see them as spies working for the government. And corruption absolutely exists. A few officers take bribes. Some conveniently ignore certain crimes if the right money changes hands. Others treat poor neighborhoods harshly while wealthy districts receive far gentler policing. Victorian London talks endlessly about justice while quietly making exceptions for people with influence and good tailoring. Still, many officers genuinely try. You have to respect that at least a little. Imagine walking alone through freezing fog every night knowing almost everyone you meet either fears you, hates you, or wants to rob you. Policemen work exhausting hours for low pay in a city overflowing with crime, disease, and desperation. Some don't survive the job long. And then there are the detectives. The real detectives. Not brilliant fictional geniuses solving mysteries beside fireplaces. Victorian detective work is far less glamorous and far more frustrating. Early detectives rely heavily on observation, interviews, informants, and pure luck. There's no fingerprint database yet. No modern forensic science. No security cameras. If someone disappears into London's foggy streets, finding them again becomes painfully difficult. Especially in poor districts where thousands of people can vanish almost anonymously. You start realizing how impossible certain investigations truly are. A witness claims the suspect wore a dark coat. Wonderful. So does half the city. Someone else remembers a hat. Excellent. London contains approximately 8 million hats. Meanwhile, newspapers expect miracles. The rise of mass newspapers changes everything about crime in Victorian London. Murders become public spectacles. Reporters swarm crime scenes. Rumors spread across the city before police even finish questioning witnesses. Every unsolved case becomes fuel for public panic and endless speculation. Nowhere is this clearer than during the Jack the Ripper murders. The police chase shadows through Whitechapel while terrified Londoners demand answers immediately. Officers search alleyways, question witnesses, follow false leads, and drown beneath mountains of newspaper criticism. And still the killer escapes. You can almost feel the frustration hanging over the city. Every policeman becomes a target for public anger. Every mistake gets printed in headlines. Every rumor spreads through pubs and markets by evening. Some people accuse the police of incompetence. Others claim corruption or conspiracy. Meanwhile, officers continue wandering through the fog hoping the next corner finally reveals something useful. Usually it doesn't. Because Victorian London hides secrets beautifully. The city itself works against investigators constantly. Thick smoke obscures visibility. Overcrowded neighborhoods bury evidence beneath endless movement and noise. Witnesses lie out of fear or confusion. Criminals vanish into lodging houses packed with strangers whose names nobody knows properly anyway. Sometimes entire families disappear overnight searching for cheaper rent elsewhere in the city. And despite all this, detectives keep trying. You picture them hunched over desks beneath weak gaslight surrounded by witness statements, newspaper clippings, muddy boots, and cold tea. Exhausted men chasing answers through one of the most overcrowded cities on earth using little more than instinct and stubbornness. Some become surprisingly skilled at reading people. A nervous glance. Mud on boots. A suspicious timeline. Detectives learn to navigate London's criminal underworld through informants, pub owners, dock workers, and terrified witnesses whispering information in exchange for protection or money. But the truth is this: Victorian policing remains imperfect because Victorian London itself is imperfect. The city produces more desperation than any police force can realistically contain. Hunger creates thieves. Poverty creates gangs. Overcrowding creates violence. And fear spreads faster than law ever can beneath streets wrapped permanently in smoke and fog. Still, every night the bobbies walk their beats. Lantern light flickers against wet cobblestones. Whistles echo faintly through distant alleys. Detectives chase rumors through crowded markets while London continues coughing, stealing, fighting, surviving. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, another mystery waits patiently beneath the fog. You never want to see the inside of a Victorian prison. Everyone in London knows that much. The prisons sit there like enormous stone warnings rising out of the fog, cold and heavy against the skyline. Dark windows. Iron gates. Walls thick enough to swallow screams. Even walking past one at night makes you instinctively quicken your pace. Because once those gates close behind you, the city outside might as well belong to another world. Newgate Prison is the name people whisper most often. And not kindly. The place has a reputation so terrible that some Londoners claim they can smell it from the street before they even see the building. Damp stone, sewage, sickness, sweat, rotting straw, and human fear all trapped together beneath low ceilings where fresh air barely survives. You imagine stepping inside for the first time. The noise hits you immediately. Coughing echoes through the corridors. Men shouting. Chains clinking somewhere deeper inside the building. Guards barking orders while heavy boots scrape against stone floors worn smooth by generations of prisoners. Nothing feels clean. Nothing feels warm. And the overcrowding is unbelievable. Cells built for a few people hold far more than they were ever meant to. Prisoners sleep shoulder to shoulder on rough straw mattresses crawling with lice and fleas. Some don't even get proper beds at all. Disease spreads quickly because disease loves crowded places almost as much as Victorian London does. You stop thinking of prison as punishment and start thinking of it as survival with walls around it. Because once inside, staying alive becomes its own full-time job. Food is miserable. Thin soup. Hard bread. Tiny portions swallowed quickly before hunger returns an hour later. If you have family willing to bring extra food from outside, you're lucky. Many prisoners don't. The cold settles into everything during winter. Stone walls trap dampness beautifully. Your clothes never fully dry. Your blanket smells faintly of mildew and strangers. Somewhere nearby, somebody coughs through the entire night without stopping. And honestly, that's one of the worst sounds. The coughing. Victorian prisons are perfect breeding grounds for illness. Tuberculosis moves through crowded cells easily. Fever spreads fast. Infections turn dangerous because medical treatment inside prison is barely better than outside, and outside isn't exactly reassuring either. A small sickness can become a death sentence surprisingly quickly. Then comes the labor. Victorian society believes prisons should punish people constantly, not simply lock them away. So prisoners work. Endless exhausting work designed to break both body and spirit. You might spend hours crushing stones into gravel until your hands blister raw. Or turning a prison crank repeatedly for no useful reason other than exhaustion. Some prisoners walk treadmills for hours like human machines while guards watch silently nearby. The work is intentionally pointless sometimes. That's part of the punishment. Not merely pain, but hopelessness. And the silence rules are terrifying too. Certain prisons force inmates into near-total silence for long periods. Imagine spending days surrounded by hundreds of people yet barely allowed to speak. No conversation. No comfort. Just footsteps, coughing, chains, and your own thoughts echoing endlessly inside your head. Some prisoners begin losing themselves completely. You hear stories about men leaving prison quieter than ghosts, unable to look people properly in the eyes anymore. Others emerge angry at the world in ways they never were before entering. Victorian prisons rarely reform people. Mostly they harden them. And children end up there too. That's perhaps the most disturbing part. Young boys caught stealing bread or pickpocketing can find themselves locked inside filthy cells beside hardened criminals. Victorian London often treats poverty and criminality as nearly the same thing, especially when the poor become inconvenient. Imagine being 12 years old and sleeping behind iron bars because hunger pushed you toward theft. Some children leave prison learning more about crime than they ever knew before arriving. Older prisoners teach tricks, scams, survival skills. The prison becomes less a correctional institution and more a grim school for future criminals. Public executions still linger in people's memories too. Older Londoners remember crowds gathering outside prisons to watch hangings like public spectacles. Vendors selling food nearby. Thousands of people pressing together beneath grey skies waiting for death to appear above the crowd. Victorian London often treats punishment as theatre. Even when executions become less public, the fear remains. Everybody knows someone who disappeared behind prison walls. A cousin caught forging documents. A neighbor arrested after a drunken fight. A dock worker jailed for theft after losing his job. Crime and poverty sit so close together in Victorian London that one bad week can ruin an entire life. And once you have a prison record, honest work becomes even harder to find. The city marks you permanently. Some prisoners turn to gangs for protection inside. Others gamble away tiny possessions just to feel something different from endless boredom and fear. Guards vary wildly too. Some are brutal. Some indifferent. A few surprisingly humane beneath rough exteriors worn down by years inside those walls. But kindness feels rare in places built around punishment. You realize something unsettling while thinking about Victorian prisons. Most prisoners aren't masterminds. They aren't villains from penny dreadful stories twisting mustaches beneath gas lamps. Many are simply poor people who lost a desperate gamble against survival. A starving boy stealing bread. A mother forging ration slips. A laborer getting drunk and violent after months of misery. A homeless child pickpocketing strangers to avoid freezing at night. Victorian London creates desperation faster than prisons can contain it. And still the cells keep filling. Every evening, as fog curls through the streets outside and gas lamps flicker weakly against damp stone walls, another prisoner hears iron gates slam shut behind them. Another life disappears into overcrowded corridors smelling of sickness and hopelessness. And somewhere beyond those prison walls, London keeps moving without slowing down for anyone. You stop making eye contact after a while. Not because you're cruel. Because if you looked at every hungry face in Victorian London, you'd never stop looking. The beggars are everywhere. Curled beneath bridges beside the Thames. Huddled in alleyways wrapped in blankets so thin they barely count as blankets anymore. Leaning against soot-black walls with hands stretched silently toward strangers already struggling to survive themselves. And the city barely notices them now. That's the frightening part. You step over sleeping bodies on your way to work before sunrise. You pass barefoot children selling matches in freezing fog while coughing hard enough to bend forward at the waist. You hear old women begging beside church steps while well-dressed gentlemen hurry past pretending not to hear. Poverty in Victorian London becomes part of the scenery. Like smoke. Like horse manure. Like the endless coughing drifting through the streets. Some beggars are old workers whose bodies finally gave out. A dock laborer with ruined knees after decades unloading cargo beside the river. A seamstress slowly blinded by years sewing under weak candlelight. A factory worker whose lungs filled with soot until climbing stairs felt impossible. Once you can no longer work, the city begins forgetting you surprisingly quickly. Others are children. Always children. You see them sleeping in doorways curled together like stray animals trying to stay warm through winter nights sharp enough to freeze puddles solid. Some shine boots for pennies. Some sell newspapers with numb fingers beneath the rain. Others simply beg openly because hunger eventually crushes pride flat. You notice how small they look against the city. Tiny figures beneath towering brick buildings and smoking factory chimneys. Faces pale beneath soot. Hands red from cold. Eyes older than childhood should ever allow. And the winters are brutal. Victorian London cold settles deep into your bones because everything stays damp constantly. Fog wraps around the streets. Rainwater leaks through roofs. Wet shoes never fully dry beside weak fireplaces burning whatever cheap coal people can afford. For the homeless, winter feels like a slow war of exhaustion against the weather itself. Some nights are so cold that people simply don't wake up. You hear about bodies discovered beneath bridges after freezing nights. Old men found motionless beside alley walls covered lightly in snow and soot. Children carried away silently before sunrise while the city keeps moving around them as though nothing happened. And honestly, sometimes nothing does happen. There are simply too many poor people for Victorian London to mourn properly. Lodging houses offer temporary shelter if you have a few pennies. But shelter might be too generous a word. Imagine dozens of strangers crammed into one filthy room thick with sweat, smoke, coughing, and damp clothes drying badly beside weak fires. Beds packed so tightly together you can feel strangers breathing beside you through the darkness. Fleas biting constantly. Arguments erupting at midnight over stolen blankets or missing coins. And that's considered better than the streets. Some places are even worse. You hear stories about rope houses where people too poor for beds pay pennies to sleep sitting upright against ropes stretched across crowded rooms. Imagine being so exhausted you can fall asleep while tied upright beside strangers snoring in the darkness around you. But when the alternative is freezing outside, people take what they can get. Soup kitchens appear in poorer districts offering thin broth and bread to desperate crowds stretching down entire streets during winter months. You watch exhausted mothers waiting patiently in the cold with children wrapped beneath oversized coats. Nobody talks much. Hunger makes people quiet. Sometimes churches try to help. Wealthy charities too. But the scale of poverty in Victorian London feels endless. Every time one person escapes the streets, another seems to arrive carrying all their possessions in a small bundle tied with rope. And the city itself almost encourages invisibility. Fog hides suffering beautifully. Gas lamps cast weak little circles of light while darkness swallows everything beyond them. A homeless child sleeping beneath a staircase becomes easy not to notice. An old woman shivering beside a market wall fades into the background like smoke drifting through the air. People learn not to stare because staring hurts. Still, small moments stay with you. A beggar sharing bread with another poorer than himself. A flower seller covering a sleeping child with newspaper against the cold. A woman quietly slipping soup to an old man outside a church without waiting for thanks. Kindness survives stubbornly in Victorian London, even when almost everything else feels cruel. But survival remains uncertain for thousands every single day. You begin realizing that homelessness in Victorian London isn't some distant tragedy happening to other people. It's a constant shadow hanging over nearly everyone living near poverty. Lose your job. Catch pneumonia. Miss rent once. Break a leg unloading cargo by the river. That's sometimes all it takes. The distance between worker and beggar can be terrifyingly short in this city. And perhaps that's why people walk faster past the homeless. Because deep down, many secretly fear they're looking at their own future reflected back through the fog. So every evening, while gas lamps flicker weakly against smoke-darkened buildings and freezing mist curls through London's endless streets, thousands search desperately for warmth, shelter, and one more night of survival beneath the cold heart of the empire. You stop making eye contact after a while. Not because you're cruel. Because if you looked at every hungry face in Victorian London, you'd never stop looking. The beggars are everywhere. Curled beneath bridges beside the Thames. Huddled in alleyways wrapped in blankets so thin they barely count as blankets anymore. Leaning against soot-black walls with hands stretched silently toward strangers already struggling to survive themselves. And the city barely notices them now. That's the frightening part. You step over sleeping bodies on your way to work before sunrise. You pass barefoot children selling matches in freezing fog while coughing hard enough to bend forward at the waist. You hear old women begging beside church steps while well-dressed gentlemen hurry past pretending not to hear. Poverty in Victorian London becomes part of the scenery. Like smoke. Like horse manure. Like the endless coughing drifting through the streets. Some beggars are old workers whose bodies finally gave out. A dock laborer with ruined knees after decades unloading cargo beside the river. A seamstress slowly blinded by years sewing under weak candlelight. A factory worker whose lungs filled with soot until climbing stairs felt impossible. Once you can no longer work, the city begins forgetting you surprisingly quickly. Others are children. Always children. You see them sleeping in doorways curled together like stray animals trying to stay warm through winter nights sharp enough to freeze puddles solid. Some shine boots for pennies. Some sell newspapers with numb fingers beneath the rain. Others simply beg openly because hunger eventually crushes pride flat. You notice how small they look against the city. Tiny figures beneath towering brick buildings and smoking factory chimneys. Faces pale beneath soot. Hands red from cold. Eyes older than childhood should ever allow. And the winters are brutal. Victorian London cold settles deep into your bones because everything stays damp constantly. Fog wraps around the streets. Rainwater leaks through roofs. Wet shoes never fully dry beside weak fireplaces burning whatever cheap coal people can afford. For the homeless, winter feels like a slow war of exhaustion against the weather itself. Some nights are so cold that people simply don't wake up. You hear about bodies discovered beneath bridges after freezing nights. Old men found motionless beside alley walls covered lightly in snow and soot. Children carried away silently before sunrise while the city keeps moving around them as though nothing happened. And honestly, sometimes nothing does happen. There are simply too many poor people for Victorian London to mourn properly. Lodging houses offer temporary shelter if you have a few pennies. But shelter might be too generous a word. Imagine dozens of strangers crammed into one filthy room thick with sweat, smoke, coughing, and damp clothes drying badly beside weak fires. Beds packed so tightly together you can feel strangers breathing beside you through the darkness. Fleas biting constantly. Arguments erupting at midnight over stolen blankets or missing coins. And that's considered better than the streets. Some places are even worse. You hear stories about rope houses where people too poor for beds pay pennies to sleep sitting upright against ropes stretched across crowded rooms. Imagine being so exhausted you can fall asleep while tied upright beside strangers snoring in the darkness around you. But when the alternative is freezing outside, people take what they can get. Soup kitchens appear in poorer districts offering thin broth and bread to desperate crowds stretching down entire streets during winter months. You watch exhausted mothers waiting patiently in the cold with children wrapped beneath oversized coats. Nobody talks much. Hunger makes people quiet. Sometimes churches try to help. Wealthy charities too. But the scale of poverty in Victorian London feels endless. Every time one person escapes the streets, another seems to arrive carrying all their possessions in a small bundle tied with rope. And the city itself almost encourages invisibility. Fog hides suffering beautifully. Gas lamps cast weak little circles of light while darkness swallows everything beyond them. A homeless child sleeping beneath a staircase becomes easy not to notice. An old woman shivering beside a market wall fades into the background like smoke drifting through the air. People learn not to stare because staring hurts. Still, small moments stay with you. A beggar sharing bread with another poorer than himself. A flower seller covering a sleeping child with newspaper against the cold. A woman quietly slipping soup to an old man outside a church without waiting for thanks. Kindness survives stubbornly in Victorian London, even when almost everything else feels cruel. But survival remains uncertain for thousands every single day. You begin realizing that homelessness in Victorian London isn't some distant tragedy happening to other people. It's a constant shadow hanging over nearly everyone living near poverty. Lose your job. Catch pneumonia. Miss rent once. Break a leg unloading cargo by the river. That's sometimes all it takes. The distance between worker and beggar can be terrifyingly short in this city. And perhaps that's why people walk faster past the homeless. Because deep down, many secretly fear they're looking at their own future reflected back through the fog. So every evening, while gas lamps flicker weakly against smoke-darkened buildings and freezing mist curls through London's endless streets, thousands search desperately for warmth, shelter, and one more night of survival beneath the cold heart of the empire. By the time night falls in Victorian London, you understand something very important. People cannot live surrounded by misery every hour of every day without searching for some kind of escape. And London sells escape everywhere. You smell the gin shops before you see them. Warm air spills through open doorways carrying the sharp scent of cheap alcohol, pipe smoke, wet wool coats, and bodies packed tightly together after long days of work. Outside, the streets are cold, damp, and wrapped in choking fog. Inside, at least for a little while, there's light. Noise. Heat. Sometimes that's enough. You step past men slumped against brick walls and push through the crowded doorway into a public house glowing gold beneath gas lamps stained brown from years of smoke. The windows sweat with condensation. Laughter crashes against the ceiling beams. Someone is singing terribly in the corner while another man pounds the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. And honestly, after the kind of life Victorian London gives people, you understand why these places stay full. Factory workers arrive coughing black soot into handkerchiefs. Dock laborers with ruined backs slump over cheap drinks beside exhausted cab drivers and chimney sweeps still smelling faintly of ash. Women carrying the weight of entire households finally sit for a moment near weak fireplaces while rain taps against the windows outside. Everyone looks tired. Not sleepy. Tired in the bones. The gin helps with that. Or at least pretends to. Cheap gin flows through Victorian London like medicine for hopelessness. Strong. Harsh. Burning all the way down your throat. One glass warms your chest. 2 glasses soften the edges of the day. 3 glasses make the coughing, hunger, and endless grey fog feel farther away than they really are. That's the danger of it. For a few hours, gin makes London disappear. You watch it happen around you. A man who spent 14 hours unloading cargo beside the Thames suddenly starts laughing loud enough to shake the room. A woman exhausted from factory work sings along with a piano missing half its proper notes. Strangers slap each other on the back like lifelong friends because everyone inside is trying desperately not to think about tomorrow morning yet. Outside waits cold rooms, unpaid rent, sickness, and work that slowly destroys the body. Inside waits temporary forgetfulness. And temporary forgetfulness becomes addictive very quickly in a city like this. The gambling tables stay crowded too. Near the back of the pub, coins clatter across stained wooden tables beneath clouds of pipe smoke thick enough to sting your eyes. Men lean forward intensely over cards while others bet precious wages on dice games they almost certainly cannot afford to lose. But people keep gambling anyway. Because when life already feels uncertain, risking money begins to seem strangely reasonable. You hear arguments erupt suddenly beside the card tables. Chairs scrape backwards. Somebody accuses somebody else of cheating. A punch lands. Glass shatters. For 1/10 second the whole room feels ready to explode before the bartender roars loud enough to force everyone apart again. Violence arrives quickly in Victorian gin shops. Too much alcohol. Too much frustration. Too many exhausted people trapped inside overcrowded lives with nowhere healthy to place their anger. And yet these places are still strangely comforting. Music halls nearby offer another kind of escape entirely. You squeeze into crowded theaters where comedians mock politicians, singers perform sentimental ballads, and audiences laugh harder than seems possible after lives this difficult. Working-class Londoners love music halls because for one evening they can forget the factories, the workhouses, the endless fog rolling through the streets outside. For a few precious hours, the city feels lighter. You realize that's what everyone is really buying here. Not gin. Not gambling. Relief. Even criminals drift through these places regularly. Pickpockets searching crowded pockets. Gang members meeting quietly in dark corners. Police officers stopping briefly for drinks during long patrols through the night fog. Victorian London mixes everyone together once enough alcohol starts flowing. The richer parts of the city pretend to look down on all this, of course. Newspapers warn constantly about drunkenness ruining morality. Politicians lecture the poor about discipline and self-control from warm homes far removed from overcrowded alleys smelling of sewage and coal smoke. But lectures are easier to endure on a full stomach. You begin understanding why so many Londoners seek escape wherever they can find it. When your days begin before sunrise in freezing rooms with leaking ceilings, when your lungs ache constantly from factory dust and smoke, when disease stalks entire neighborhoods and hunger waits one missed paycheck away, reality itself becomes exhausting. So people drink. People gamble. People sing loudly in crowded rooms glowing against the darkness. Not because Victorian London is joyful. Because sometimes joy is the only rebellion people have left. Near midnight, you step back outside. The warmth disappears instantly. Fog curls through the streets thick as river smoke while distant laughter fades behind closing doors. Somewhere nearby, a policeman's whistle echoes faintly through the mist. A drunk man stumbles past singing off-key beneath the gas lamps. Farther away, a child sleeps beneath an awning wrapped in newspaper against the cold. And suddenly London feels heavy again. The gin shops and gambling halls cannot truly fix anything. Morning always comes eventually. The factories still wait. The rent collector still knocks. The city still coughs and starves and struggles beneath grey skies darkened by smoke. But for one night, for one drink, for one song shouted badly beside strangers equally exhausted by life, people manage to forget the weight of Victorian London pressing down on them. And perhaps that small escape is the closest thing many ever get to freedom.